story. A United Kingdom travel warning citing possible terror threats in South Africa has caused an uproar. News 24 reports that Pretoria has expressed outrage over the warning, while the UK says the warning has been in place since 2022, when the US warned of possible attacks in Sandton. To discuss this, I am joined now by Dr. Ahmed Jazbhay, who's an executive member of the Media Review Network. Dr. Jazbhay, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Firstly, what are your thoughts on the motives behind these warnings, particularly considering the lack of evidence provided to even support these claims of a possible terror attack?
Good afternoon, Chancellor, and good afternoon to your viewers. I think personally we have to view this terror threat, and as you rightly said, it is nothing new, but we need to view it in conjunction with other threats, the threat from the U.S. Embassy, the threat of a bombing in Sandton. We have to view it in light of the developments in the U.S. Congress as well, where certain congressmen came up with a bill, although it's been defeated now, to sanction South Africa or review South Africa's relations with the U.S. because of its anti-Israel stance, as well as we also need to view it in conjunction with other, with yesterday's threats against South Africa should not arrest any Israelis, any South Africans who have served in Israeli defense forces. So we need to view this not in isolation, but as a continuation. And the reasons behind this, if I may, is that these are thinly veiled attempts to pass on a message to South Africa that South Africa needs to stay in its own lane, stay out of the domain of the West. It appears that, you can use the liberal institutions, be it the ICC, be it the ICJ, or any other institution for small fish, but do not use it against any of our allies. And the ally in question is Israel. And I think this is the bigger issue at play here. And we must not take sight of it, because if we do lose sight of it, it affects our sovereignty in terms of continuing up our own foreign policy.
So the UK's travel advisory also mentions concerns about these heightened tensions globally, particularly regarding, as you've mentioned, the conflicts in the Middle East. How do you see these global dynamics then influencing perceptions of security here in South Africa?
I think, there is always this threat that South Africa will be victims of terrorist threats, given that we are involved, for example, in a mission in northern Mozambique, which is about to end, I think it is in around July. So this perception will always be there. And there's a perception that South Africa's security agencies are quite weakened during the previous administration. And that makes us easier targets towards any sort of, terror threats. But South Africa has always said that any threats, any intelligence that foreign agencies have should be shared with the SSA. And in this case and many other cases in the past, it was not shared with the SSA. And Zane Dango bemoaned this, and he sounded quite irritated, to be honest, that every time there is these threats, there is no sharing of intelligence, which is against the established protocols, which is why we have to view these threats with suspicion, because it speaks to other issues at play here, that South Africa, because it took Israel to the ICJ, because it's trying to get Netanyahu arrested at the ICC, and we know how powerful these institutions are, but they don't seem to be powerful enough to getting justice for the global south, the Palestinians, the Sudanese, and whoever else. So I think these are deeper issues that we need to interrogate and take further.
Dr. Jazbhay, from what I see, there seems to be a discrepancy, if you will, between the perspectives of South African officials who question the credibility of the terror threat, and also experts who suggest potential risks as well, especially in light of South Africa's involvement in these counter-terrorism operations. How do you reconcile these differing viewpoints?
I think these so-called terror threats and so-called terror experts, we have to, for example, follow the money. Who funds these organizations, be it, Terrorism and Research Consortium, who funds these organizations. So we need to follow the money when it comes to the so-called experts, because the so-called experts never really talk about, the other terror threats. They seem to be very honed in on the so-called ISIS threats in South Africa and the issue when the Tutsi twins were arrested and finally convicted. They seem to hone in on that, but they don't seem to go into the cause of these terror threats, which is, the oppression of innocent people. Well, there's no excuse for it. We have to always go to the source of any problem in order to find solutions. So these terror experts seem to be on the side of, for example, the global north whenever they're analyzing situations, and never seem to want to go to the cause of the problems. And we have to look at geopolitics here. And when it comes to Israel, it seems Israel is a red line for the Western world. Whether it be Canada, be it the US, be it UK, they seem to be red. It's the most important ally of the West. And these sort of issues are never interrogated. Why? And we know, for example, in the US, there's APAC, the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, which finances a lot of congressmen and in fact, influences American foreign policy. It's the most influential lobby group in the United States, like more influential than NRA, the National Rifle Association, or the military-industrial complex. It is very powerful, and it influences these the U.S. congressmen as well as the U.S. government. So we need to interrogate these issues. While there is a disjuncture between the so-called analysis of experts as well as what is coming out from DIRCO and so on, it is our duty to interrogate the story beneath the story in order to understand, are these threats real? Are they credible? And why are established protocols not being followed when these threats are being issued by foreign governments?
So we've covered aspects including what experts suggest that the UK's warnings may be politically motivated, possibly a response, like you said, to South Africa's foreign diplomacy or policy decisions. And I'd really want to get or delve more into the UK's advisory, which highlights specific areas in the country, notably where these terrorist attacks could play out or potential attacks could play out. Give us your thoughts on this aspect.
Yeah, the terror advisory spoke about shopping malls, tourist attractions, basically any area in which lots of people may gather. And that is something very general because terror attacks in the past, around the world seem to attack, religious gatherings, tourist sites, and so on. But they were not very specific. What kind of terror threats, who is behind this, and so on. It made a reference to, for example, it could be ISIS and so on. But again, it must be, we must, when we delve deeper into this UK advisory, we know it's not a new one. We know that it's just been updated. And why has it been updated now? What is the reason behind it coming out right now? Yeah. And what is the reason as to why it is not being shared with the local intelligence? Don't they trust the local intelligence, or are there political motivations in order to, for lack of a better word, whoop South Africa into line and for it to stay out of the domain of the West and its allies?
Now, Dr. Jazbhay, considering South Africa's recent deployments of troops in Mozambique and the DRC as well, do you believe these actions have increased the country's vulnerability to these so-called terrorist attacks, as some experts suggest?
I think so, certainly. I don't think South Africa had any reason to go into, for example, northern Mozambique, Cabo Delgado. I know that mission is come to end, I think it's on the 15th of July, and I hope that it's not being approved for a longer stay. That does put South Africa into the firing line because the ISIS, so-called ISIS cells within northern Mozambique have issued a threat that South Africa should stay out of this if it doesn't want to be a target. So there is these issues. But when it comes to Cabo Delgado, we know there's the issue of resource extraction by Total, the French company Total in Cabo Delgado. Yeah. We know that there's severe discrimination against those in northern Mozambique. Northern Mozambique is an exceptionally poor part and disenfranchised and impoverished part of Mozambique. And none of that resource wealth is being shared with the citizens of northern Mozambique, thus making it a fertile ground. So while South Africa can be in the firing line, we have to look at the geopolitical situation in northern Mozambique. And and ask ourselves the question, why is Total being allowed to extract resources without benefit to the local indigenous populations, and which allows this fertile ground for these instability and insurgency groups to fester and gain fertile ground.
So your organization, the Media Review Network, has also characterized the travel advisories as part of a broader attempt to really undermine South Africa's sovereignty. How do you then view the intersection between a foreign policy and the national security in this context?
Foreign policy is always the domain of the executive of government. And when we see foreign governments trying to, issuing the terror threats, when we see legislators trying to, review AGOA and so on, but there's a lot of posturing one must understand in terms of foreign policy. It inevitably is an attempt to affect South Africa's sovereignty, to say that, you do not play in our domain. And if South Africa cannot, make its own decisions when it comes to foreign policy and so on, it must worry all of us. We took Israel to the ICJ and so on, and that seems to be, stirred up at hornet's nest. And because, as I said a few times now, that Israel is the most important ally of the West. And any attempt to, affect this relationship means that foreign governments are going to come down hard. So sovereignty is severely affected because South Africa, as we know, is quite a weak economy. We rely a lot on exports to the UK and the EU. We rely a lot on exports to the US, to AGOA, and so on. And they know that South Africa relies on this quite large, to a very large extent. So they use this to try to affect, realign South Africa's foreign policy. And when outside forces are realigning your foreign policy, this affects your sovereignty. Of course, we do not live in a bubble and isolation, and outside events are going to affect any government. But ultimately, our foreign policy, should be one based on human rights, one that expresses solidarity with the most oppressed, and so on. So we need to stay true on justice. And if we cannot stay true on justice, then we become another outpost of oppression for our own citizens and beyond.
Dr. Jazbhay, very quickly, and also looking ahead, what steps do you believe South Africa should take to really address the concerns raised by these travel advisories, while also maintaining its diplomatic independence, but also its national security interests?
I think very simply there is going to be a lot of engagements, which I'm sure there have already been. There have been engagements with the U.S. ambassador, with this infamous Lady R. saga. There's going to be a lot of engagements with the U.K. I know the DG Zain Dango has said that they're going to reach out and so on. So they will be. South Africa is not in a position to, as I said, operate in isolation. We're going to have to operate with the global north and cooperate with the global north. So there's going to be a lot of established ensuring to speak to foreign governments to ensure that established protocols are followed. If there's a need to redefine or realign those protocols, then so be it. So there is going to be a lot of realignment and discussions. But these discussions must take place within the respect of South Africa's sovereignty. South Africa has a long-established history with oppressed peoples, be it Cuba, be it the Palestinians, and many other regions around the world. And we have to stay true to that. Because at the time in the world, which, Palestinians, for example, have few friends. I mean, most of the Arab world has, abandoned the Palestinian cause. South Africa has stayed true. And whilst we have a lot of issues domestically, the ANC government hasn't carried itself with glory on this front. But we need to ensure that when it comes to our foreign policy, that we remain firm but fair, that we can cooperate with the global north, the US, UK, Canada, and so on. But at the same time, we must ensure that we do not let it slip up on our solidarity with the oppressed peoples around the world, not just the Palestinians.
Thank you so much for your time. That wraps up our conversation with Dr. Ahmed Jazbhay.